So today I will be presenting a response to the argument for marginal cases. This regards specifically the ethics of eating animals. Very quickly, you have to address the context behind what the argument for marginal cases is. Placius, in her book, describes it as the belief that there is no morally relevant characteristic possessed by all humans and lacking in all non-humans, which would justify different moral treatment for humans. Under this argument, there is no reason for which we as humans should consider our interests over those of animals. Down here, in this diagram that I have below the definition, I have sort of a linear thought process as to what follows if we were to adhere to this argument for marginal cases. So if we accept the validity of the argument for marginal cases, we can come to the conclusion that humans and animals are equal in all non-moral respects and belong in the same moral community because they deserve equal moral consideration. Therefore, being in the same moral community, if we kill and eat an animal, we are violating this equal moral consideration, and killing and eating an animal, therefore, is unethical, as it is a violation of what should be equal moral status to the human. So, having looked at the last slide, we can see that kind of the brunt of the marginal argument, the biggest premise, is this part where we say that humans and animals are equal in all non-moral respects. This is, of course, a pretty big claim, and it's kind of concluded by using the quotes below. The marginal cases will argue that any property we try to use as proof is lacking in some humans or appears in some non-humans. Therefore, there is no morally relevant property, as there is no group that has it that some other group doesn't have it. Furthermore, we wouldn't feel comfortable excluding humans that find themselves as marginal cases from being part of this moral community. So like we wouldn't feel comfortable excluding infants or those that are senile or those that are disabled from our moral community. So we naturally would make an exception that cordons them into our moral community. But then the argument for marginal cases says that by making this exception for them and including them even though they don't have that relevant property, it makes the characteristic irrelevant, further solidifying the fact that there is no morally relevant property that can be used to differentiate between the standards that we have for humans and the standards that we have for animals. So, getting on to the official response, there's one key word in all of this that I think is missing from the marginal cases argument, which is capacity. Primarily, this response is going to address the premise that humans and animals are equal in all non-moral respects. I want to specifically address the disregarding of some properties that they put forward, like speech or rationality, like when they say that infants don't have speech or those that are disabled don't have rationality. I think the first major fault that the marginal cases theory presents is its failure to see humanity as a collective unit. It will focus, for instance, on how one individual has speech while some other individual is a mute. However, the bigger picture is that being human includes having the capacity for speech. Speech is something biologically hardwired into humans, whether it's in your larynx or the parts of the brain that focus on speech translation, speech uh, formation, just anything that has to handle with speech that is in humans is biologically hardwired at some point in your biological lifespan. And by that I mean from your moment of conception to death, at some point in that entire lifespan, you have the capacity within you to do this morally relevant characteristic, whether it's having a sense of self, producing speech, rational thought. That means that those that are lacking these morally relevant characteristics, they aren't missing the components that make them possible. They aren't missing this capacity. Rather, they instead have something additional that inhibits it. So, for instance, someone that is mute still has that part of the brain that allows them to have the capacity for speech. They still have their larynx. The difference is that they also, in addition, have brain damage or speech muscle damage that inhibits these tools that let them speak. So they're inhibiting their natural ability to talk. Those that are in a coma, of course, won't be able to speak. Those that won't be in a coma won't be able to have rational thought. But what's additional with them is that their unconsciousness that they are in, the coma, is inhibiting their natural ability to respond to the stimuli of the environment around them. those that are senile and are losing their physical abilities and cognitive abilities. It doesn't mean that they didn't have that hardwired into their genetic code. It means that additional things like diseases like Alzheimer's or just brain cell death over time is inhibiting their abilities that they had to for these morally relevant characteristics. So essentially, the point I'm trying to get to is that a human in and of itself is a blank slate that has the capacity for all these morally relevant characteristics like speech, rationality, and anything else that could be deemed relevant. Um, and so, because we are all this blank slate at some point in our biological lifespan, we have the capacity for these characteristics, which means that when we include marginal cases like infants or the disabled or the senile, we aren't making exceptions for them. They are simply being included in a group that they deserve to be included for because they, just like everybody else, had the capacity or have the capacity or will have the capacity for these morally relevant characteristics. So we aren't making exceptions, and that contradicts the marginal cases argument because by not making exceptions, we aren't deeming any characteristics irrelevant. So there is a just reason to consider our interest over that of animals. It is important to note that this response doesn't address what that morally relevant characteristic is, but that's not really the point I'm trying to get at. What I'm trying to say is that um, there should be the possibility and existence of a morally relevant characteristics because we aren't eliminating my response doesn't eliminate anything on the basis that some humans don't exhibit it. It includes these things because it says that all humans should be hardwired for it in the first place. Furthermore, this response doesn't really argue that eating animals is ethical. Simply, it argues that the marginal cases argument should not be used to argue that eating animals is unethical.